Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Willie Handler. He is a multi-genre author, and second-generation Holocaust survivor who transformed from government policy expert to influential writer. Welcome to the show, Willie.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show, Willie. The welcome to the show. Welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk right now. We'll be talking about survival. We'll talk about stories and a mix of both. So, but first, before we come to stories, let's understand a bit about your story, about your journey, your background, so that people know who they are listening to.
Yes, I've had sort of multi careers in my life. I at one point was a hospital administrator, and I moved on to be a government policy expert. Uh, Left the government, became a consultant, then suddenly found myself an author, and I published several humorous books, satirical books, and I decided to do something a little bit more serious. And I just recently completed a memoir, and it's called Out from the Shadows.
Right, right. So I want to understand why suddenly an author? Means anything you were a hospital administrator, an insurance expert, consultant. Why an author? Because this was something a bit different line. So I want to understand your motivation, your understanding of all these things.
Well, first thing, when I was working in the government as a policy expert, I did a tremendous amount of writing, very large reports and studies and things like that. So writing was not something foreign to me. At one point, I decided I wanted a different kind of challenge, and I said, let me see if I could write a speculative fiction book. So I went about it. Actually, the first book is based on, it is sort of a satirical book. It's a political satire based on my career within the government. So it wasn't that difficult of a challenge, or at least a transition, but it was something that I really wanted to try.
Right, right. And that too within this, writing, you move from fiction to non-fiction writing. That's a lot of, courage. So how did that happen?
Well, you know what? I never intended on writing a nonfiction book, let alone a memoir. Uh, but my wife, she convinced me I should tell my family story. I wasn't convinced that the world needed just another Holocaust book. And then I sort of thought about it, and I realized, I didn't know much about my family's history because it just wasn't spoken about much in the family. And I started becoming more and more curious, started to do a little research, and I finally decided, you know what? I am going to do it because it's sort of a little bit of a sort of a soul searching exercise. And I also decided this was something that would be of value to my family as well. So that's kind of how I slowly transitioned. I can tell you that when I first tried to write down my family story, it was an 1,800 word blog post. That's all I knew.
Right, 1800 blog post. But a book is a book. Where did you get the material for the memoir or book? Because it's not so easy when you are putting it out as non-fiction and something as a piece of history, if I may use the word. How easy or difficult was it for you?
It was actually much more difficult than I ever thought it would be. When I sat down to write the memoir, I approached it like every other book I'd ever written. but it just didn't work out that way. It really it took me on a journey that I'm really still on. It was clearly transformational. It forced me to re-examine uh, how I felt about my parents, all my relationships, my priorities in life. It was a rough go for a while. As I started remembering things from my past, um, along with those memories came a lot of buried trauma. As it turns out, I carried around as much trauma as my parents did. Just getting back though to the question about where I found material, I did basically a 2 year long search. I searched archives, online databases. I looked at oral testimonies from other survivors, books and essays. I even traveled to Poland, where my father came from, back in 2022. I visited places my father never even talked about. And so this is not really a true memoir. It's almost, I call it an investigative memoir because of all the work it took to really get the information to write the book.
Right, Billy. So we'll come to the book part, the details of the story part. Let's understand a bit, about your parents. How was it growing up with Holocaust survivor parents? Help us understand, was it like every other parent, or is what different? It was a bit different being raised by Holocaust survivors.
Well, I when you're young, you think, isn't every family like this? But as it turns out, no. As you start to grow older and became more aware of the world outside your home, you realize it wasn't it wasn't we weren't like other families. We weren't even like other immigrant families. Um, both my parents were traumatized, much more prominent with my father. He experienced considerable amount of anger and grief. He was really distrustful of others, even his own kids. He tried really his best to sort of bury his memories and his trauma. He was really reluctant to speak about his experiences, which is why I had to do so much investigating. If I asked him questions, he would begin to weep. So you kind of learned not to ask questions. Um, and best to describe it is, um, he sort of lived in the present, but was unable really to shake the pain from his past. So both my parents, they were very, very loving, but they were also very distant and involved. So what does that mean? It means that very much growing up, you're kind of like on your own. There's no one to help you with homework. There was no one sort of to take you to play sports, um, ask you how your day was, to deal with problems that you had with other people or at school. You had to deal with everything on your own, which, as a child, that puts you in a survival mode at a very young age. And so growing up, I became, best to describe it, sort of insecure, lacked confidence and trust.
Right, Billy. So, what was your parents' story? Uh, you were their son. So that part, after your birth, you know about it. But what was it before that, when they were in Poland, 20s, and you also visited your father's place in Poland. So I want to understand. You must have done all this investigation. What was their story? What happened with them? How did they land up? It's a very common knowledge. People landed in trouble during those times. But then, what was the story? How did they survive? How did they come to this? In Canada, or did you go to any other place first? How, what was that story like, which you have mentioned? How did you build up that story without them telling them you?
Okay, well, my father was born in a small little village in central Poland in 1912. There were I was, and the family had probably been living there a couple hundred years. I actually did search back until the sort of mid 18th century, and then there were no actual records anymore, so I couldn't go back any farther. But I did trace back my family to my fourth great grandfather. That village that they lived in had 2,500 residents, 1,500 were Jewish. And in fact, today, that village has, and I went to visit it, that village has 500 people and no one is Jewish. Um, when during the Depression, my father's family moved into a larger community called Benzine. It had 50,000 people, and of which half were Jewish. And they moved there because of, for economic reasons mostly, also because smaller villages, there was more anti-Semitism. When the war broke out, um, in September of 1939, within 4 days, the German army marched into my father's town, and after that, everything changed. They set up a ghetto. They started deporting men to work in forced labor camps. During that time, my father he was married. He got married and had kids. Um, Eventually, he was deported to a number of camps. He actually, by the end of the war, was in 7 different uh, forced labor and concentration camps. His family, his wife, his children, parents, a couple of his sisters, they were gassed in Auschwitz. They were murdered. Um, and he was barely alive by the end of the war. My mother, her name was Shifra Zlodjever. She was born in 1912. She was born in Romania, in a very small village as well, even smaller. And in 1940, and without getting into the politics of Romania, because Romania went back and forth, that sided with Germany and then sided with the Allies. But in 1940, there was a pogrom in her village. Pogrom is basically just where the Jews are attacked and their property destroyed, a lot of people killed. So every Jewish home in the village was destroyed, and they were expelled from that village and went into a larger city. Within a year, and that city had like about 5,000 Jews. Within a year, everyone in that whole region was deported out of Romania, out of that province, into a region in Ukraine called Transnistria. And she spent the remainder of the war there in a ghetto that probably not much better than a concentration camp, other than there was no gas chambers, but many people died of starvation and typhus. And she was liberated by the Russian army in the spring of 1944. Both my parents eventually made their way to Israel. My mother arrived in 1946. She was an illegal immigrant. She snuck into the country on ships. I think if anybody ever saw the movie Exodus, that's the kind of story it was. My father arrived 2 years later after the state of Israel was created. They only stayed about 4 or 5 years. My father didn't like that sort of pioneer life, that's what Israel was like in the early years, and wasn't comfortable about all the sort of neighboring Arab countries that were quite hostile at the time. Not that they're not hostile today. So they eventually they eventually immigrated to Canada because my father had a brother who was already there. So that was sort of in a very short encapsulated way their experience from 1939 until they came to Canada.
Right, right. And how did it all impact you? Uh, Staying with your parents, knowing about their story, that there was a past, but that you didn't know about it in full. And then you, as you said, you investigated into everything and found about. How did these different phases impact you? It's also heartening to know about your family's, roots and all. But at the same time, you also feel a very different sort of pain. What pain your parents had to go through, and it impacts everyone, every human.
Yeah, it's true. So interesting is um, like trauma is not a unique thing to Jewish people or Holocaust survivors. You know, it comes back. It impacts on soldiers coming back from war or civilians caught in the middle of a war. So, excuse me, it's not anything unique. Um, but when it impacts an entire community, which is in some case, you know, like several million people, it has a profound effect. And so for me, and it's multi-layered because there's different sources of trauma. So, uh, you know, people who are subject to sexual violence growing up, they've been traumatized. So my trauma was partly from my childhood, where I, I had two distracted parents because they were dealing with their own issues and also really struggling to make a living and providing for the family. And I should note they did a good job of that as far as providing food and shelter and clothing, so on and so forth. But they were incapable of providing any emotional support. So that was a sort of a, you know, the childhood trauma was a source of trauma, but there's also generational or inherited trauma. And so the best way I can describe what that is trauma when a trauma survivor, if somebody survives trauma, some of that trauma can get passed on to their descendants. That's what sort of generational trauma does. And how it works is your body stores trauma. And not only does your body store the trauma, but in some cases, this trauma gets imprinted on your chromosomes, your genes, and can change them. And so that what happens is that through your genes, that trauma gets passed on. So an example might be that as a result of the trauma experienced during the Holocaust, you might become hypersensitive to hostile people. Or I know here's a classic example. I just thought of one. I know of somebody whose mother was terrified of dogs because in the concentration camp they had the SS guards had nasty German shepherds that would attack the prisoners. So she had this, so that traumatized her. And her one of her children inherited that. And that is through genetic material. So as for me, I not only did I experience that childhood trauma, but there were elements of my father's own trauma that got passed on to me, such as grief. And so I experienced a lot of grief as I started learning about family members who were murdered. I started to take on that grief that I inherited from my father.
Right, right. So, I want to understand from you, uh, Willie, is that then you went for therapy at the age of 69, if I understand.
That
Yeah,
That
was
is
it
correct.
after the book or before the book?
During the book, so as I as I think I mentioned it, as I started remembering things in my childhood, um, a lot came. It was all this buried trauma, and at one point I was not in very good shape, and I just decided at the age of 69, all of a sudden I need to go for therapy, and I'm going, well, why not? I wanted to get back to where I was. And that's an interesting process because um, during the therapy process, more memories started coming back to me. In fact, there was a point where I went back to my manuscript and started adding stuff to it that I remembered through therapy. And again, and through the therapy, more trauma came out. So I actually got worse before I got better.
And then you got fully better. How was that
Well,
experience?
I would have. I am not fully better. I'm much better. I'm still in therapy. I don't know for how much longer, but I'm still trying to deal with a lot of these issues.
Right. So, what would you like to tell people, about uh, all those things, about intergenerational trauma and everything? From your experience, what would you like to tell them? How should they handle themselves?
Well, one of the things I've learned, and I but partly because I'm writing another book on generational trauma, and I've interviewed a lot of people who have similar experiences to me. And one of the important message I have is I see a lot of people suffering in silence and not and just holding um, all that trauma, anxiety, depression, holding it all in, and it would be very helpful if they could share their experiences and what they're feeling with others. It doesn't even have to be with a professional, a therapist, but with other people. Because I spoke to people who they were telling me their story for the like what I'm doing with you. They were telling me their story for the first time. They had never told anyone, and so it's very important that and actually that's one of the ways in which to stop the transmission. So um, share not doing what my father did, but actually sharing your experience, what you're feeling, and encouraging your children and other family members to talk about it as well, because that's how you prevent that. By releasing that trauma, it's less likely that it's going to be passed on.
Right. So, your book, if you can tell the name once again, your book, is it more about the family story, or would you consider is it something of a more such books, a lesson about history, a lesson about that we should tread with care as we walk into our future? How would you like to see your book?
Well, I can tell you, I my book is really in sort of I consider it being in three parts. One is telling my family story, which I thought was very important, and I've told it within the context of World War II. So their story is embedded in the history of Europe during that wartime. Then about my upbringing, my childhood as well. And the third part is this whole issue around trauma and hate, and where sort of the genesis for those things are, and what sort of lies ahead in the future.
Right. And there
And
is
I
another book coming up, you said.
yes, I'm working right now on another book. It will be I think the working title is The Hidden Victims, and which is very appropriate because many people recognize survivors from traumatic events as being survivors, right? And being traumatized. But most people don't realize that unless they receive proper therapy and treatment and care, they're passing on that trauma to the next generation. And they end up being victims as well, but hidden.
Right. Right, Willie. And what about the book on Martians? Where did that come from?
Ah, well, yes, that is a. When I was younger, I had a great love for science fiction books, and so I wanted to write a science fiction book, but science fiction is not really a genre that I can really write. So I wrote a science fiction spoof, and as it turns out, of the fiction books, it's my most popular one. There's some great characters in it and some great scenarios.
Wonderful. There's so much to learn about all these things from you, Willie, about life in the
Right.
past, looking to the past, looking at your
Thank.
present, and also seeing into the future. So, for those
Right.
people who would want to learn more about you, about the book, what is the best way for them to connect with you, Willie?
Okay. So I'm very active on Twitter. For those who are on Twitter, and that's my Twitter handle is, and you can just search for Willie Handler. I have a website also, and it's williehandler.com. Very easy. These things very easy for me to remember.
Absolutely. Very
and
easy.
and and Instagram as well. Also, Willie Handler. Amazing. But the name of the book is not Willie Handler. It's by Willie Handler. It is Out from the Shadows.
Absolutely, absolutely. It is good that you wrote that story. Some stories need to be out of the shadows into the limelight, into so that we all can learn from. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition. You wanted to add something, Willie?
No, other than this is my first visit to India, and it looks pretty good.
It is indeed good. It will be indeed good. And as I said, your story is telling us a lot of stories within that stories. So with this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much too.